What is up, everyone? Welcome to Stat Chasing Week 7. My name is Sam Hoppen, and I am your host for the show. If you haven't watched before, first of all, thank you for joining me. This is where I'll be going through all of the key stats and metrics that I think are important to help lay a foundation for understanding what happened this past week, what's happened the past couple weeks, to hopefully give you an idea and get you ready for week 7, already a third of the way through the season, which is crazy. But before I get into the details, want to talk through some of the stats that I'll be using today. From PFF is where I get all of my routes data, which is included in targets per route run, weighted targets per route run, which I'll talk about, and pretty much any routes specific metric I use is from PFF. I also use their expected fantasy points metric, which is a model built that weights opportunity by the line of scrimmage, and I use this primarily as a measure of usage for players to try and understand which players are getting specific roles and which ones are getting the highest value roles in their offense. From the NFL play-by-play data and NFL Faster, I get the majority of my stats, which include air yards, which is the distance that the ball traveled in the air before it gets to the receiver. Included in that is Whopper, which is weighted opportunity rating. This is a metric that Josh Hermsmeyer created a couple years ago, which weights target share and air yard share. Have Racer, which is receiver air conversion ratio, which is receiving yards divided by air yards, which is a metric shown for efficiency, shows a receiver's ability to convert air yards into actual yards. And then on the flip side, have Pacer, which is passing air conversion ratio. It's passing yards divided by passing air yards and shows how well the quarterbacks or their receivers are converting air yards into actual yards. I've also calculated quarterback adjusted yards per attempt, which is yards per attempt, but gives bonuses for touchdowns and takes away for interceptions. Also have pass rate over expectation, which is another model built to determine whether a play will result in a drop back or not. And if the team does pass it when it's not, then then they get a boost for that. So how much over expectation teams are passing it. And then finally have CPOE, which is completion percentage over expectation. And that, again, is a model shown as to whether you would expect a pass to be completed, and for quarterbacks, whether they completed it over the expected amount. Finally, have a couple of stats popularized by the man Ben Gretch himself. That includes weighted targets per route run, which is targets per route run, but weights air yards and routes run with a scalar included, and gives a little bit more weight to players getting more downfield targets. And also have high value touches, which is a running back specific metric. It is carries inside the 10-yard line and receptions. And then any touch inside the 10-yard line, whether it's a catch or a carry, is considered a green zone touch, which I'll be referencing as well. So I'll be going through the stats position by position so I can compare against others in the position. Again, help you make some start, sit, waiver, or trade decisions in your league. Maybe put some DFS spin on it as well. And then I'll go more in-depth through a couple of team situations at the end. A reminder to subscribe to the YouTube channel, become a member on YouTube for just $5 a month to get early access to the show, be able to watch it live with all of our great friends, be able to have access to the Discord and a bunch of other benefits as well. Also, one final shout out to @ChangeCollege on Twitter, who has been doing the timestamps on the YouTube for each of the positions and team conversations, which I know is extremely helpful. Lets you skip to the conversations that you want to listen to. So with that, let's get into the quarterback position. I'm pulling up the chart here, and one note as I get into it, as you'll see on the chart, this first one is weeks 2 through 6. So I'm going to start doing a rolling 5-week average, average or view for each of the positions, along with just the prior weeks, which I'll pull up here in a minute. And the reason I chose 5 weeks is that I did some offseason studies with TJ Hernandez at 444, looking at what the sort of best sample size is for positions and at what point is there a cliff as far as predictability going forward. And 5 games was about that. And plus, as we start to get into the bye weeks, it'll help with players who may have only played 4 games in a stretch and stuff like that, and give them at least 4 games to show here. So on the quarterback specific chart, have adjusted yards per attempt on the x-axis, touchdown rate on the y-axis, and then the size of the bubble is their rushing yards per game. And these metrics specifically are efficiency metrics because that's what we're looking for in our quarterbacks. For fantasy football, volume is not as big of an indicator as you would expect it as it is for running backs. And someone who hasn't been that efficient, he's been a little bit better from a real football perspective than a fantasy perspective, is Mac Jones. He's the guy who I'm going to start with for quarterbacks. He's been pretty good. Like I said, after not throwing an interception in his first 2 starts, he's thrown at least one in each of the last 4 games. So that's not super great, but he's thrown a touchdown in all but 1 game this year. And what's most impressive for him is the 6.1% CPOE. Like I mentioned, that's completion percentage over expectation, which is among the top 8 quarterbacks and is exceptionally impressive for a rookie. I think a lot of the other rookie quarterbacks have struggled in that metric. He's averaging 245 passing yards per game. He's outside, I believe, the top 15, if not top 20 in fantasy points per game. So I wouldn't trust him as a starting fantasy quarterback quite yet. Possibly, and this is one of the few dynasty notes I'll add, but possibly worth a buy low in dynasty and super flex leagues. I don't know if you can really buy low on a rookie at this point, but I think one thing to note is just sort of how this team, the Patriots, have been run after being pretty pass happy in the first couple of weeks. The Patriots barely have a positive pass rate over expectation on the season now. They rank 14th in the league. I saw this morning that Mina Kimes actually called out Bill Belichick for being too conservative with his play calling, specifically on some of the 4th down situations that they've had. And I have to agree with her a little bit. I mean, Jones is not playing out of his mind by any means, but he's playing solid enough that Belichick should trust him in some high pressure situations, should trust him to throw the ball. So I think this means the most for the Patriots pass catchers, who, again, there was obviously a lot of question marks coming into the season as to whether Mac Jones would be able to support them. And I think he's certainly doing enough. Now, someone who's struggled a little bit more to support his receivers, and he's been thrown into a tough situation, but that's Geno Smith. He obviously is now the Seahawks starting quarterback, while Russell Wilson is on the mend. And I think I'm realizing now that Geno Smith doesn't show up on this chart here. So I'll because I have a filter on, again, combined passing and rushing attempts set at 50, but I'll flip to just the week 6 chart so you can see him He's right near Patrick Mahomes, which is kind of funny. But he had a solid day this past week. This was his first start of the season, came in relief in week 5, but had a 72% completion rate, had 209 passing yards and a touchdown. But he has been helped tremendously by his receivers. He has a 1.34 pacer on the season, has a 6.9 adjusted yards per attempt, which isn't terrible. It's nice, as some might say. He does have a 5.3 yard average depth of the target, though, which is not that great. He's not taking any downfield shots, and this is going to cap the ceiling of his receivers. It's down significantly from the 9.1 yard average depth of target that Russell Wilson was throwing with. The Seahawks get the Saints at home in this lovely Monday Night Football matchup this upcoming week, and then they host the Jaguars, which is probably the game that gives him the best shot to have a solid week. But I think if there's one positive to glean from this Geno Smith situation is that the top 2 targets in Lockett and Metcalf have stayed that. They've gotten 11 and 10 targets respectively from Geno Smith. That's the most. No other receiver has more than 6 targets across the game plus that Geno's played. So I was surprised at how much Geno Smith actually threw it. I believe he had 32 pass attempts in this past game. And with Alex Collins potentially injured, you never know how much more they're going to throw it against the Saints. So I wouldn't be that concerned about the Seahawks pass catchers at this point. The last quarterback I'll talk about is Tua Tagovailoa. He had his first game back from injury. The Dolphins were certainly not shy about giving him his full workload. He threw the ball 47 times in the London game against the Jaguars. Played a really good game overall, I think, aside from one pretty bad interception. He had a 70% completion rate, threw for 330 yards and 2 touchdowns. He also had a 6.3% CPOE in the game on top of a 7-yard adjusted yards per attempt. And all of these were a massive, massive improvement over his first game this season. And the Dolphins remain one of the pass heaviest teams. They currently rank 3rd in pass rate over expectation. And Tua is actually set up with some favorable matchups against the Falcons and the Texans. He has a matchup at Buffalo in between those two. And Buffalo will be coming off a bye, so may not want to start him then. Hopefully he gets Devontae Parker and Will Fuller back sooner rather than later, because that certainly can't hurt him. Because if they keep passing as much as they have, then I think Tua will have some solid weeks for sure. I know we've got a decision this week with the ship chasing crew with Josh Allen on bye on who to pick up on waivers, and Tua probably the top option, especially if they continue passing the ball as much as they have. So that's it for the quarterback position. No other notes today, but I'm going to get right into the Jaguars running backs. Got rushing expected points on the x-axis, receiving expected points on the y-axis, and then fantasy points over expectation as the size of a player's bubble. So if they have a smaller bubble, then they're underperforming relative to expectation, and vice versa. I have James Robinson as the cover boy for this episode and want to kick off the running back position talking about the Jaguars backfield, because we now have 2 weeks with Carlos Hyde back in the lineup after missing week 4. And as crazy as it is to say, I think Urban Meyer might finally be coming to his senses with regards to how they're using their running backs, because Hyde has been almost completely phased out. He has played on just 20% of the snaps the past 2 weeks. He did not record a single touch in week 6. He did have 1 target, but this is after a game in which he only had 5 carries and no targets. To put this in perspective, before his injury, in the first 3 weeks of the season, Hyde had gotten 33% of the team's running back touches, which was enough to be an annoyance for James Robinson managers. And that's now, over the past 2 weeks, down to just 11% of the running back touches. So all this is to say that with this lack of usage for Hyde and a bump in usage for Robinson, is that James Robinson RB1 season is back on, which is great. I think expounding on the differences between Robinson's usage before Hyde's injury, Robinson had a 67% touch share. That has now skyrocketed to an 87% running back touch share, which is actually higher than his 85% share that he had last season. So whether or not that's sustainable, I think, is yet to be determined. But if he's at 80+%, that is huge. He's gotten 11 total high value touches over the past 2 weeks compared to just 2 for Hyde. He's averaging 20 opportunities per game in the past 2 weeks and has just under 18 per game on the season. Robinson also saw a season high 85% snap share in the games that Hyde has played in week 6. And Robinson has 5 touchdowns in his last 4 games, along with being the highest graded rusher according to PFF. So Jacksonville is entering their bye after playing in London. So hopefully that doesn't give Urban Meyer too much time to overthink how he's using this backfield. But when they return from the bye, they face Seattle, Buffalo, and Indianapolis. So should be wheels up for James Robinson moving forward. Moving on to the Chiefs running backs, we got our first look at how this backfield would shake out without Clyde Edwards-Helaire. And as expected, Darrell Williams got the majority of the work. In week 6, he had a 72% snap share. He ran a route on 54% of dropbacks. He had over 21 expected fantasy points on the back of 25 opportunities. He had a whopping 6 high-value touches, thanks to getting all 3 of the green zone touches. Overall, got an 86% share of the running back touches, and I think he'll be a high-end RB2 while CEH is out. I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, and I meant to write it down, but Ryan McDowell from DLF tweeted something out today about how in the last 18-ish games of CEH's career, after getting several, I think 4 or 5, maybe 6 carries inside the 5-yard line in his first game, has gotten 3 in the last season plus. Darrell Williams got 2 carries inside the 5-yard line this past week. So there's a little bit reason to be concerned about CEH when he gets back. But anyway, Jerick McKinnon is the other name to keep a lookout for, and is worth an add at this point, especially if we see the Chiefs offense get rolling. He had a 28% snap share in the game this week, which was actually down from his 31% snap share in week 5. This is likely due to the Chiefs being in control of the game for the whole, second half and being able to run it with Williams. He ran a route on 30% of dropbacks, which is solid, but was also down from the week before, but only got 7 opportunities and had just 1 high-value touch. But like I said, he's worth an add. If Williams does get hurt, I would expect the Chiefs to go sign another running back, and it might even be a more even split between McKinnon and whoever they sign. But the Chiefs get the Titans, the Giants, the Packers, Raiders, and Cowboys before their week 12 bye. So I would have said earlier in the season that only 2 of those teams would have put them in a potential negative game script, but who the hell knows at this point? The Chiefs are not who we thought they were. Moving on to the next backfield, I'm going to switch over to the Week 6 chart for running backs. Going to focus on the Panthers running backs. We now know, unfortunately, that Christian McCaffery is on injured reserve. He's out at least another 2 weeks, though it could be longer. Last week, I mentioned that Chuba Hubbard was being treated like Mike Davis from last year, but that continues to hold true. In the 3 full weeks that Christian McCaffrey's been out, Hubbard has seen his routes run rate rise, and every week he's gone from 20% to 41% to 46% this past week. So he's not yet being fully weaponized as a pass-catching threat. He's only got a 10% target share and fewer than 4 targets per game. But that doesn't really matter with the rushing workload that he's getting. He's leading the team in running back touch share at 82% on just over 21 opportunities per game. Has an okay 3.6 high-value touches per game, but is the only one to have gotten a single green zone touch since McCaffrey got hurt. Overall, he's averaged nearly 16 fantasy expected points per game, 10 of those coming from rushing and the other 6 coming from receiving, which is really good for a running back. And finally, he's averaging -2 fantasy points over expectation, which is a sign of potential good things to come, especially with upcoming matchups at the Giants and at the Falcons. Excuse me. Rodney Smith was someone that was looking like he'd be treated as the primary pass catching back, but the Panthers ended up cutting him, giving way to a slightly larger role for Royce Freeman, who has seen his snap share grow in each of the last 3 weeks, but the peak, which came in week 6, was only at 31%. And Freeman is not nearly as much of a threat in the passing game because he's only seen 2 total targets in the past 3 weeks. I think you can add Freeman if he's out there, but I wouldn't be confident putting him into a starting lineup at this point unless, again, unfortunately, something happens to Chuba Hubbard. So the last backfield I'll talk about today is the Chargers backfield. And I haven't talked much about the Chargers because we kind of know what they are. I mean, you're starting Justin Herbert, you're starting Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, you're starting Austin Eckler, but really need to start focusing on teams like this, I think, especially as the season goes on. Injury rates potentially get a little higher, and the reason is that I want to be able to identify who the backup is in each situation, even if we know who the clear-cut workhorse is. And excuse Crosby for shaking and sneezing all over the place, but I'm going to skip over talking about Austin Eckler because, again, he's an RB1. He's a starter each and every week. He obviously had a down game this past week, but I would not worry. It's more about identifying who could take over if, God forbid, he got hurt. And initially, it looked like Larry Roundtree was going to be that guy, but he was a healthy and active this past week, didn't play a single snap in week 5, and had also looked like at least the goal line back before that. He had an average of 6.5 opportunities per game and two straight games with 1 green zone touch before disappearing the past 2 weeks. He had only played a max of 29% of snaps, going as low as 14%, and before week 6 was the only other Chargers running back to get a carry inside the opponent's 5-yard line. Now, in his stead, Joshua Kelly has come onto the scene. He's played 32% of the snaps or more in each of the last 2 games. He's only gotten 6 total opportunities across those 2 games, but it looks like he sort of supplanted Justin Jackson, who's only gotten a snap share above 20% once. Now, that said, we've seen situations in the past where the actual handcuff doesn't get used when the primary running back is healthy, and other role-specific players like Roundtree in the short yardage situations get more opportunities in their specific situations. So maybe that's what's happening with Jackson, because he has gotten a couple opportunities each game and is probably the most well-rounded back. But I think if all three are healthy, I would probably rank them rest of season: Joshua Kelly, Larry Roundtree, and then Justin Jackson, because we need to be Bayesian in our thinking, as Ben Gretchhoffen points out. And even though Roundtree has sort of had the better season on the whole, being a healthy and active essentially the past 2 weeks means that he's sort of fallen out of favor with the Chargers coaching staff, which is obviously not great. We've seen Tyson Williams be a healthy scratch and just not be a factor. So that's how I'd rank them rest of season, but opportunity to snag any one of them on the waiver if you can. A couple other nuggets on the running back position. Leonard Fournette looks every bit the bell cow back. I believe I talked about him last week, but he led the league this past week in both high value touches and green zone touches with 12 and 6 respectively. Scored again in week 6, and even though the Bucs are passing so much, he continues to get the vast majority of the workload. Unfortunately, Kenny Gainwell RB1 season is on hold for now. Gainwell hit a season low 23% snap share, and it was his second straight game below 30%, which he had been above in each of the first 4 games. It was also his first game without a carry this season and only got 2 targets. So I don't know that this really changes anything for Miles Sanders, but I'd certainly hold on to Kenny Gainwell, because it's not like Boston Scott is really taking over that role. On the flip side, DeAndre Swift RB1 season is still in full effect. He had a season high in running back touch share at 78%, has actually seen his snap share rise in each of the last 4 weeks, topping out at a season high 78% snap share this past week. So Dan Campbell is officially off the shit list for now. Khalil Herbert, the rookie running back for Chicago with Damian Williams out due to COVID, he had an 89% snap share. He got every single running back touch for the Bears. I don't know if Williams will be out next week. I kind of doubt he will be, so it'll be interesting to see how these two get used in a game against a tough Bucs defense. But if one or the other is out, it makes the other one a clear start, I think, because of the usage that they're getting. The last one I'll touch on is the Texans backfield, and forgive me, I forget who brought up the Texans. I said I wasn't going to talk about them. I'll give them a quick note here, but Mark Ingram had 20 touches for the first time since week 1. David Johnson led the backfield in routes there, so there really weren't any changes in usage despite a highly negative game script for the Texans. Philip Lindsay looks like he is a non-factor in this offense and is probably the de facto handcuff to Mark Ingram. So if there's one, if all 3 Houston Texans running backs are available on the waiver wire, I'd shoot for Mark Ingram first and then David Johnson, especially as we hit some heavy bye weeks for some key players. Those guys could have some solid fill-in weeks. Going to jump now to the wide receivers. I've got the wide receivers' weighted targets per out run on the x-axis, air yards market share on the y-axis, and size as the fantasy points over expectation for the size of the bubble. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second, but I'm just so distracted because I'm looking at the chart and Jamar Chase's bubble is just massive. Like, he is just so far exceeding expectations, and I'm not going to talk about the Bengals wide receivers in depth today. Obviously, the trio had a relative down game this past week, despite the Bengals scoring 34 points, but they'll bounce back, I would expect, in weeks to come. The first group that I do want to talk about is the Giants wide receivers, and I really don't know why I did this to myself trying to talk about these guys, because nobody's played all 6 games, which makes the splits very difficult. At this point, it's basically a who's left standing situation for the Giants. Kenny Golladay didn't play this past week and I think is questionable at best for this upcoming week. Kadarius Toney re-aggravated his ankle injury on his 3rd reception of the game. But Sterling Shepard, the bright spot, finally returned to the lineup, had himself a great game, so would expect him to continue to play, but to be determined on the other two. But want to talk about Sterling Shepard, who is the Giants wide receiver 1. And in his first game back after missing 2 consecutive weeks, he had 14 targets, and this was his 3rd game this season with at least 9 targets. Ran a route on 96% of dropbacks and is his 3rd game above 95%. Has a 24% target share and 24% air yard share on the season for a solid 0.5 Whopper and a 0.58 weighted targets per route run. So really strong metrics across the board for Sterling Shepard, someone who is consistently underrated in draft season throughout the season. Probably does not have the overall season-long ceiling that other players have, but his floor is so damn high. I mean, 14 targets. There are not many players who can get that many targets in a game. So certainly someone to be holding on to. I don't think I would be selling high on Sterling Shepard. Kadarius Toney, I'll talk about in the context of weeks 3 through 5, because that's when he was fully healthy and sort of started his breakout. During that 3-game stretch, he led the team in targets with a 23% target share, had a very solid 22% air yard share. Can also see his ability to make moves after the catch with his 1.38 racer. He had a 72% routes run rate and was the only player on the Giants with double-digit receiving expected points per game at nearly 13 per game. He had over 2 fantasy points over expectation per game, though. So it'll be really interesting to see, again, how this wide receiver core gets used with Shepard, Toney, and Golladay all healthy, which it seems like we always say with the Giants. The next guy I'll talk about is Kenny Golladay, who, again, missed his first game of the season this past week. So going to look at him through the lens of weeks 1 through 5. And again, like the overlaps of these players is a little wacky, but in those games, he only had a 16% target share, which isn't great, but he led the team in air yard share at 25%. Also had a 0.52 weighted targets per route run, which isn't great, but not terrible either. Had just under 11 receiving expected points per game. And in his absence and in Toney's absence, Dante Pettis, who I didn't even know played for the Giants until this week, he got 11 targets in this game, and I wouldn't consider adding him yet unless we hear that one of or multiple of these receivers are going to be out for an extended period of time. And if I if I were to rank these receivers rest of season, it would definitely be Shepard first overall, and then Galladay and Kadarius Toney in the next tier below them. And again, excuse my lovely neighbors for doing some great construction in the background. Hopefully it doesn't last too long here, but going to press on and talk about a slightly more encouraging wide receiver group, and that is the Ravens wide receivers. It was our first game with Rashod Bateman, and you need to take this with a little bit of a grain of salt because Sammy Watkins missed the game, but it's unknown whether he'll be back soon, as he was out with a hamstring injury, and those can tend to linger. But nevertheless, Rashod Bateman directly took over Sammy's role. He tied the team high with 6 targets for a 22% target share, but only came away with 4 receptions for 29 yards, ran a route on 66% of dropbacks, which is pretty good for his debut. He only had 40 air yards, but would expect that to increase in the future. He did get to nearly 11 receiving expected points in the game, which I believe was second, on the team. So I think a very encouraging start for Rashod Bateman for sure. This was a very run-heavy day for the Ravens. They had 38 rushes to just 27 passes, which is actually well below their season-long pass rate of 52%. But this also meant that it was a down day for Hollywood Brown. And I think if there's any time to buy low on Brown, it's right now. I think, and I'll get to the stats here in a second, but I think that among the fantasy football community, Brown's just not seen as a wide receiver one, even in his offense in fantasy football, and he's been producing like one. And I think he can be had for something like low-end wide receiver 2 value because there's just this stigma with him. Managers are still frustrated by the drop touchdowns in, what was that, week 3, week 4? But in any case, the reason you can buy low, I think, is Brown saw season low 42 air yards after 4 straight games with at least 96 air yards. It was only his second game this season with fewer than 19 PPR points, so he's been extremely efficient. Has a very good 0.62 weighted targets per out run and 0.54 whopper, and a really, really good 0.83 racer for how many air yards he's been commanding. And then speaking of Sammy Watkins, he was actually third on the team in target share at 20% before this week. So if he's out an extended period of time, then there is a lot of opportunity available. He was only running a route on 71% of dropbacks, though, which isn't terrible, but that's, again, along, sort of on the same wavelength of the role that Bateman filled at 66%. I think Brown is a must start every single week, but it still remains to be determined how things will shake out between Bateman and Watkins when they're both on the field. And while Watkins is out, Bateman, I think, could be a solid flex option, but nothing more than that. So switching over to the week 6 chart on the screen here. And the last wide receiver group I'm going to talk about is the Buffalo Bills. And Stephon Diggs answered my prayer, finally scored another touchdown. He could have had a second one if not for a late underthrown ball and some really bad pass interference on defense. But his day was coming. I've said it multiple times this season. They're entering a bye, so I think the buy low opportunity is now probably gone. And I think what remains the most annoying part of this Bills passing attack is Emmanuel Sanders, who's honestly a much bigger part of the offense than I think a lot of people expected him to be. heading into the season. He actually has the highest target share among the top 3 receivers, in him, Stephon Diggs, and Cole Beasley, but it's at 18%, which is pretty good. And he has the second highest air yard share at 32%. He's also the only Bills player to be running a route on at least 90% of dropbacks. Granted, Diggs is at 87%, and I think came out of the game a couple times last night because of injury, but still would hope that Diggs would be closer to 94 or 95% of routes run. Getting back to Sanders, though, he has a 17.3 yard average depth of target, which is just incredible given what he had been for most of his career. Before this, he's averaging, and this is where it gets frustrating, he's averaging less than 1 point per game in PPR than Diggs. And again, that's just, it's very triggering because all of the metrics say that Diggs should be blowing it out of the water again, but he isn't. He's still leading the team in most of the major metrics. Like I've said, he's getting 17.6 expected points per game, but it's just not quite on the level of that last year. He has a 35% air yard share, which again is only 3 percentage points ahead of Sanders, but has a 26% target share, a 0.61 Whopper, and 0.71 weighted targets per route run. So all of these are really good. It's really just the touchdowns and his catch rate specifically, which has dropped from 76% last year to 64%. And I brought it up a couple weeks ago. His completion percentage over expectation when targeted has dropped from 11.6% in 2020 to just 3.6% this past year. And that 3.6% isn't bad, but when you see that Emmanuel Sanders, Gabe Davis, Cole Beasley are all ahead of him, then you start to wonder. And it could be a factor of him getting some more downfield targets. But again, like, Emmanuel Sanders is doing just fine. Finally, get to Cole Beasley. He's just, again, steady Eddie, 20% target share, second on the team, 81% routes rate, 12.4 expected points per game, 0.21 targets per route run. He's a solid flex play any given week, especially with how much Buffalo throws the ball. A couple of nuggets to round out the wide receiver position. Courtland Sutton this week joined Davante Adams as the only 2 players to have recorded 200 plus air yards in multiple games this season. It's also Sutton's 3rd straight game with at least 150 air yards. The Broncos play the Browns on Thursday Night Football this week. Sutton could be a solid captain play because he looks every bit an alpha wide receiver in that offense. Speaking of air yards, more air yards fun. Before this week, Allen Robinson had averaged 47 air yards per game, but he finished with 161 in week 6, which was the first time he went over 100 air yards on the season. Darnell Mooney is averaging a half a target per game more than Robinson, and seems to have a slightly better connection with Justin Fields. And I sent out an updated version of the team passing concentration target chart this afternoon. And over the last couple weeks, the Bears, I believe, have the most concentrated passing attack between those two and Cole Kmet, who I'm going to talk about here in a second. But they just don't pass enough, which will be another point. Over the last 3 weeks, Robbie Anderson has caught 10 of 29 targets for just 87 yards and a touchdown. Ben noted in his Stealing Signals newsletter that Anderson and DJ Moore sort of flipped roles from a depth of target perspective this past week, but hopefully that doesn't hold because DJ Moore had been crushing it in that sort of intermediate area role. And then finally, Jakobi Meyers, TV watch. He scored a touchdown. And then it was called back due to a holding penalty. So just another week without a touchdown for him. Maybe They play the Jets, so maybe this is his week. But alas, we move on. For the tight ends, it's the same chart as the wide receivers with weighted targets per route run on the x-axis, yards market share on the y-axis, and fantasy points over expectation as the size of the bubble. TJ Hockenson had been in a bit of a slump with games of 3, 8, and 4 PPR points in weeks 3 through 5 after starting the season with back-to-back games of 20-plus PPR points, but he returned to form this past week with 15 PPR points in week 6, thanks to a season-high 11 targets. And really the only thing that had drastically changed for him was the targets. He had gotten 2, 8, and 3 targets in the 3 games that I just mentioned. His routes per dropback rate has fluctuated sort of all over the place, with it falling to 74% in week 3, but has been above 82% each of the last 3 weeks, which is good. He still has a very healthy 19% target share on the season and 20% target share of the last 3 weeks. And over those 3 weeks, his receiving expected points is at 11.5 per game, and he has negative 2.2 fantasy points over expectation per game. So a sign of good things to come. Obviously, it was a bit of a drought for Hockenson over that stretch, but I would not be concerned whatsoever. Cole Kmet, like I mentioned, going to talk about him, and he's another NFC North tight end, but I'm not as confident about him. I think he can probably be dropped almost anywhere. Right now, the team has obviously had a lot of flux this season, specifically with the quarterback position, who's calling plays, and they just aren't passing the ball. But he hasn't scored double-digit PPR points in a single game yet this season. Since his 7-target week 1, Kmet is averaging 3.4 targets per game, but a lot of his other numbers are solid, albeit not elite. He's running routes on 73% of dropbacks, has a 17% target share, and negative 1.8 fantasy points over expectation per game. I was actually messaging with Ben earlier, and he mentioned that there are really 2 things that need to go right for Kmet to break out. One, the offense needs to improve from both an efficiency and a volume perspective. And 2, Kmet actually has to be a good enough player, though he does profile as someone who should be able to break out. So I think if you have a deep enough bench, maybe hold on to him this week, because they do play the Bucs, and teams have been passing all over the Bucs. But if he doesn't do any this week, then it's straight to the waiver wire for Cole Kmet. Last note is that Tyler Higbee played 100% of the snaps in weeks 1 and 2, that hadn't been above 84% the past 3 weeks, but was back to 100% this past week. Fortunately, cashed the under 36.5 receiving yards with 36 yards this past week, was about a half yard away from falling into the end zone, but his 86% routes run rate was his highest rate since week 1. So certainly encouraged to see that. To round out the show, going to talk through 2 team situations, the first of which is the Minnesota Vikings. And Kirk Cousins is again having a quietly good fantasy season. He's currently the quarterback 10 on the season. He's averaging just under 21 fantasy points per game, which is more than Joe Burrow, Aaron Rodgers, several others. And overall has had just a really solid year so far. He has an 8.2 adjusted yards per attempt, 70% completion rate, and a 3.2% CPOE. He's averaging just under 300 passing yards per game and over 2 passing touchdowns per game, despite Minnesota having a negative 3% pass rate over expectation. I wouldn't say that he's a quarterback one, but he's very close and definitely a suitable bye week fill-in. As far as the running backs, there really isn't much to say here other than it's all Dalvin Cook when he's healthy and all Alexander Mattison when he's not. In the 4 games that he's been healthy, Cook has averaged nearly 25 opportunities per game. Mattison, on the other hand, has gotten 34 and 32 opportunities in the 2 games that Cook was out. Cook has been used ever so slightly more in the passing game than Mattison. His routes run rate has been above 48% in each of the 4 games that he's played, while Mattison only has 1 game above 48% and hasn't gotten a target in the last 2 games that Cook has played. And now we got Crosby just messing around and messing with my groove. But I don't really think this is either. Alexander Mattison has 15 high-value touches across the 2 games that he started, while Cook has 15 across the 4 games that he started. The more I think about this, Mattison, I'm not saying Mattison is the better back, but he's the better option when Cook isn't around than Cook is when he's healthy, because Dalvin Cook has Alexander Mattison creeping behind, down his back, and Mattison doesn't have someone like Cook does. If that even makes sense. That very well might not, but hopefully it does. So yeah, either one of them is startable if they are the primary guy. The pass catchers have a similar story. Justin Jefferson, and Adam Thielen are studs. They should be started every week. Where I want to focus here are on the tertiary targets. And let me start with KJ Osborne, who scored the game-winning touchdown in overtime on Sunday, and he seems to pretty clearly be the third option in the passing game with a 17% air yard share and a 15% target share. He's running a route on 76% of dropbacks, a 0.42 weighted targets per route run. And that said, he has some potential for negative regression. He's averaging nearly 4 fantasy points over expectation per game, which is second on the team behind the touchdown machine, Adam Thielen. I don't think anyone is starting Osborne except in DFS, but he should be rostered everywhere because he will be the biggest beneficiary should one of the top receivers get hurt. But moving on to the tight ends, Chris Herndon truthers had their day because he scored a 2-yard touchdown on his lone target of the game for his 3rd target of the season. You can pretty much ignore him because he's only playing on 17% of snaps this season. On the other hand, Tyler Conklin most certainly should be rostered, at least in tight end premium leagues. He has a 69% route rate on the season and is growing in the first 3 weeks. Excuse me. He was at a 63% rate, and that has jumped up to 76% in the last 3 weeks. He has on the season a 15% target share, is averaging 5 targets per game, and has at least 4 targets in all but 1 game. He is averaging 8.5 expected points per game, which is 3rd on the team among running backs. So again, a low-end tight end 1, high-end tight end 2. And with how gross it is, you could certainly do worse at the position. The final team that I want to talk about are the Indianapolis Colts. And they are led by Carson Wentz, who hasn't played great, but he hasn't played terribly either. He's got 9 touchdowns on the season to just 1 interception, which is a vast improvement from the past. He's averaging 257 yards per game, which is about 10 yards higher than his career average of 247 before this season. He's got a 1.12 pacer, so he's getting help from his receivers, but only has a 64% completion percentage despite a 1.9% completion percentage over expectation. Has a solid 8.7 adjusted yards per attempt, and he's pretty much near league median for every stat, which again, it is an improvement. Though he's only averaging 16 fantasy points per game. He's another potential bye week fill-in with games against the Titans and Jets in weeks 8 and 9. But what I want to focus a little bit more on is the backfield. And what I think is the most exciting is that Jonathan Taylor looks like he's taking over this backfield. Now, I need to caveat this with the fact that the Colts have had back-to-back games with extremely positive game scripts against both the Ravens and the Texans. Obviously, still lost against the Ravens, but they were leading and ahead by double digits for a large portion of that game. But after double-digit opportunities in 2 of the first 3 games, Nyheim Hines only has 15 total opportunities combined in the last 3 weeks, while Jonathan Taylor is averaging 18 per game in his last 3 games. And the biggest thing, and what I've talked about often this season, is that Jonathan Taylor has seen his routes run rate rise in each of the last 4 weeks. It's gone from a season low 26% in week 3 to a season high 61% in week 6. Now, again, that could be because they're comfortable having him on the field when they're up big and he's just running more routes because of it, but it's certainly encouraging. It could be worse. It's better than him not being on the field, but Marlon Mack is the third part of this backfield, and I'm not really sure what's going on with him because it sounded like they wanted to trade him. He got 12 opportunities in week 4 and hasn't done much outside that except get some garbage time touches, which we would obviously rather have go to Jonathan Taylor. So again, I mentioned their schedule. They do play the 49ers in week 7 on Sunday Night Football, but until there's a game in which you're really confident that there's going to be a negative game script for the Colts, I don't think you can start Nyheim Hines because you've seen that he has gotten just completely phased out. The biggest reason I wanted to talk about the Colts today is because good friend of the show, Eric Belair, asked me to help figure out what's going on with the Colts wide receivers. And tell me if you've heard this before, but Paris Campbell is hurt and is expected to miss a significant amount of time. This actually coincides well with the return of T.Y. Hilton, who just did his thing against the Texans this past week, absolutely torched them, finished with 4 receptions on 4 targets for 80 yards, which is not bad for his first game back. In fact, he led the team in targets with 4 on Sunday. No other player had more than 3. Wentz only threw it 20 times, so take that for what you will. But he had a 70% routes run rate in his first game back, a 16.8 average depth of target with 67 air yards, and his 0.77 weighted targets per out run in week 6 led the team as well. I think a lot of people are probably freaking out about Michael Pittman, but he's had at least 7 targets in 4 of 6 games this season. He has yet to run a route on fewer than 92% of dropbacks in a single game, which is excellent. Nobody's taking snaps away from him. He's got a 24% target share on the season, 35% air yard share, and a healthy 0.59 whopper, 0.55 weighted targets per route run. So there is no reason to believe that the breakout is on hold. Behind him, Zach Pascal has been the most reliable receiver. He's seen 5 targets in every game up until week 6 when he only got 1 target, but is running a route on 92% of dropbacks. He's second on the team in receiving expected points per game, behind only Pittman. So he's, I think, a bench stash at this point, but not starting him. If I had to choose one tight end to roster from the Colts, it would probably be Mo Alley-Cox. His and Jack Doyle's numbers are pretty much the same across the board, but he has a 2-point per game edge in fantasy expected points. So I'll take the guy with the higher value opportunities on the season. It seems like Mo Alley-Cox is the bigger end zone threat right now. All right. That is going to do it for the show today. Thank you all for listening in. I hope you enjoyed it. I will be back next week. Make sure to tune into the show tomorrow night at 9:15 p.m. Eastern Time. Become a member of the Discord. Subscribe to the YouTube. Support the crew. And have a great week 7.